We now move from quantitative vote dilution to what's known as qualitative vote dilution. These are cases dealing with districts that have equal numbers of people in them, but the way the districts are drawn is said to dilute the vote of a particular political party or racial group. And in doing so, those who draw the lines are effectively minimizing the voting power of a particular group by either packing them or cracking them or stacking them in particular districts. And so the roadmap for this lecture on partisan gerrymandering starts with an analysis of the bipartisan and incumbent protecting gerrymanders. And then we talk about the history of partisan gerrymandering at the Supreme Court, which culminated in this famous case in 2019 called Rucho versus Common Cause. But that hasn't been the end of the story, because state courts have been involved now in partisan gerrymandering cases and have sort of picked up the baton that the Supreme Court has given to them. I'll conclude with a bit of a sort of political scientist take on how to measure partisan bias and the new computer modeling that is used to evaluate partisanship in the redistricting process. So let me start by asking a few questions. The first is, can partisanship ever be a permissible factor in redistricting? Or should we always draw districts without regard to partisanship? Second, does excessive partisan gerrymandering violate the Equal Protection Clause? So even if we think partisanship could play a role in the process of redistricting, when it becomes excessive, does it violate the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution? And if we do believe that excessive partisan gerrymandering raises constitutional questions, does an administrable standard exist that can separate out the permissible and impermissible uses of partisanship in the redistricting process? In a sense, how much partisanship is too much partisanship for the Constitution? And if we agree that there is an administrable standard, well, how might we prove excessive partisan bias? What are the statistics, the data that's necessary in order to show that a given plan unfairly treats members of a political party? So we return to the original gerrymander again. Remember, this is the districting plan that Elbridge Gerry created in order to dilute the votes of his political opponents in Massachusetts. And so this original gerrymander used malapportionment in order to overrepresent anti-federalists at the expense of federalists at the time. And it was both a partisan gerrymander in the traditional sense and a violation of one person, one vote based on the cases that were described in the previous lecture. It also used multi-member districts and all kinds of other stratagems in order to diminish the voting power of his political opponents. So the basic definition of partisan gerrymandering is the use of the line drawing process in order to draw plans that unfairly advantage one's own party at the expense of the party that doesn't have the ability to draw the lines. And so the challenge is in trying to sort of think about and grapple with the constitutional questions concerning partisan gerrymandering is that map makers usually know the partisan proclivities of voters, right? If you're someone who's involved in redistricting, you probably know where Democrats and Republicans tend to live. So it's very difficult to excise partisanship completely from the process. Secondly, even if you were to take out partisanship completely and to have a computer draw the map without reference to partisanship, it's not as if the outcomes would be nonpartisan or bipartisan or fair. Just because you have random redistricting doesn't mean that it means that there's not going to be partisan bias. Because single member districting systems rarely produce proportional representation. So proportional representation is the system of representation used actually in most countries around the world, where the number of votes that a political party gets will then be reflected in the number of seats that that party gets in the parliament. When you use geographic-based systems of representation, like single-member districts that we have in the US with what we call first-past-the-post elections, where whoever gets the most votes in that district gets essentially 100% of the representation from that district. So first-past-the-post elections with single-member districts tend to produce disproportionate outcomes. So for example, if 90% of the voters in a state that has 10 districts all happen to be Republicans, we shouldn't expect that 9 out of 10 seats will then go to the Republicans. We would expect all seats probably to go to the Republicans because of the distribution of the voters throughout the population. You get a certain bonus when you have so many more people than the other party voting for you. So one reason that we might not ignore partisanship is that in order to evaluate whether a political redistricting plan is fair or not, you probably need to know whether it advantages the Democrats or Republicans in particular areas. And so there's this case, Gaffney versus Cummings in 1973, which upheld the bipartisan gerrymander of Connecticut General Assembly districts. So a bipartisan gerrymander is different than a partisan gerrymander in that a bipartisan gerrymander usually results from the collusion by the Democrats and Republicans to draw safe districts for each other. So if a state is, let's say, 60% Republican and 40% Democrat, and has 10 districts, the Democrats and Republicans might collude together to draw 6 districts that have reliable Republican majorities, 4 districts that have reliable Democratic majorities. And so that collusion causes, certain people to be uncomfortable. Who is harmed by a bipartisan gerrymander? You could say that independents and moderates are harmed because now the party primary will often be the determinative election in these districts. So if you have some districts that are highly skewed Democratic, you'll end up having the Democratic Party primary being the critical election to determine who emerges. So moderate voters might feel out of luck because you'll get more extreme candidates coming out of these districts where one party has a monopoly. Also, minor party members might be upset by this. That's to say, like Greens and Libertarians and others, if putting together districts just on the basis of safety for Republicans or Democrats is the basis for representation, minor parties might feel left out. But that's true for even minority party members in particular districts. So if you're a Republican living in a district that has now been drawn intentionally to elect a Democrat, then you feel that your right to vote has been abridged or diluted. As I said earlier, and as the court explains in Gaffney versus Cummings, in upholding the bipartisan gerrymander there, a politically mindless approach like random redistricting doesn't necessarily produce a fair outcome. And so the court asked the question in Gaffney as to whether requiring that partisanship be taken out of the process is actually what the Constitution requires. Because in doing so, you could trade what would be partisan fairness, although a lack of competition under a bipartisan gerrymander, to a randomly drawn but incredibly unfair plan that leads to dramatic results that are out of balance with what the state population party preferences are. So you could have a random districting plan that turns a state that's competitive, say 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, into a districting plan that's, elects 7 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And so the court says that the decision to draw these safe districts that are safe for Democrats or Republicans is perfectly permissible under the Equal Protection Clause. So now, if partisanship can be a legitimate factor in redistricting, which is what Gaffney versus Cummings basically holds, when does it become excessive and potentially unconstitutional? Now, there were a series of partisan gerrymandering cases that the Supreme Court adjudicated. The first significant one is a case called Davis versus Bandemer out of Indiana, in which the court said that partisan gerrymandering cases presented justiciable questions. I'll discuss after Bandemer a district court case affirmed by the Supreme Court called Badham versus U coming out of California, in which it seemed to take the teeth out of any standard that came out of Davis versus Bandemer. But then the 2 most recent and significant cases are Veith versus Jubileer and Rucho versus Common Cause. In Veith, the court upheld a gerrymander in Pennsylvania's congressional districts, but at least kept open the possibility that there would be authentic partisan gerrymandering causes of action. And that door was closed in Rucho versus Common Cause, where the court has now retreated from partisan gerrymandering as a justiciable political question. So what was Bandemer about? In that case, you had the Indiana congressional districts were seen as biased because of partisan gerrymandering. And the court said, okay, you can litigate these cases, and here is the standard under which we're going to separate constitutional from unconstitutional uses of partisanship in the redistricting process. The court says that if the electoral system is arranged in a manner that will consistently degrade a voter's or a group of voters' influence on the political process as a whole, that would raise concerns under the Equal Protection Clause. And such a finding of unconstitutionality must be supported by evidence of continued frustration of the will of a majority of voters or effective denial of a minority of voters of a fair chance to influence the political process. Now, there are a lot of pretty vague words in that standard. So perhaps it's not any mystery that this standard turned out to be not very easy to operationalize. And so you didn't have courts striking down redistricting plans as being excessively partisan, because to consistently degrade a voter or group of voters' influence on the political process as a whole would be very difficult. In fact, in Badham versus You, this case dealing with the gerrymander of California's congressional districts, the fact that there were 40% of the congressional delegation was Republican, that there was a governor and a senator that were Republican, and that Ronald Reagan was the president at the time, and he was a California Republican. The mere existence of all of these other sort of avenues of influence for the Republicans was enough for the court to say that, you have not lost your influence on the political process as a whole. And so therefore, what was a pretty extreme gerrymander by the Democrats, that nevertheless that was constitutional under the Equal Protection Clause. And so until Veith versus Jubileer in 2004, the Bandemer standard led to different people making claims of unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering, but none of them ever really won, because if the kind of evidence that was in Badham versus You would be enough to defeat a partisan gerrymandering claim, then it was going to be very difficult for any other plaintiff to win. Veith versus Jubileer, however, seemed to hold out hope for the possibility that the court would get involved in partisan gerrymandering. And while it's effectively been overturned by Rucho versus Common Cause, it's worth spending a moment discussing it, because the different justices involved in the case articulate different types of standards that they would use for partisan gerrymandering. So just to say what the result was, 4 justices, Justice Scalia, who wrote the plurality opinion, Chief Justice Rehnquist, Justice O'Connor, and Justice Thomas, would hold that partisan gerrymanders presented non-justiciable political questions. Their position eventually gets vindicated in Rucho versus Common Cause. Then there are 4 justices, Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer, who would strike down the gerrymander at issue in Pennsylvania. And then there's Justice Kennedy, who was the tie-breaking vote, who would have left the partisan gerrymander in place, but wanted to at least raise the possibility and the hope that they could come up with a standard, an administrative standard for unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering in the future. And so he invites plaintiffs to sort of still go into court on other legal theories, perhaps under the First Amendment, to litigate partisan gerrymandering claims, which is what happened actually between 2004 and Rucho versus Common Cause. Now, the different dissenters in the case offered different standards as to what would distinguish the permissible from impermissible uses of partisanship in the redistricting process. So think about whether these are the kinds of standards you think judges could apply in a given case. So Justice Stevens married several different lines of case law together to say that, look, if partisanship is the predominant factor in the construction of a district, not even a districting plan, but a district, that violates the government's duty to govern impartially and raises concerns either under the First Amendment or under the Equal Protection Clause. Second, Justice Souter, joined by Justice Ginsburg, would have applied a standard borrowed from employment law of burden shifting, where the plaintiff would prove that there was a disregard of traditional districting principles, that there was a high correlation between partisanship and the way the lines were drawn. And then the defendants, the state, would have to come back and say, no, even though these might be biased, as you suggest, or even though these correlations exist, there are good reasons why these districts are drawn in a particular way. And then third, Justice Breyer, who focused mainly on the problem of minority entrenchment, that there's something inherently wrong if a minority is able to keep itself in power by redrawing district lines. And so he would apply some sort of totality of the circumstances test to ascertain whether a majority party was trying to keep itself in office by unfairly drawing lines that would continually frustrate the will of a majority of voters to capture a majority of the seats in a state legislature. So between Veith and Rucho, social scientists took up Justice Kennedy's invitation and refined methods and measures for partisan bias. Lower courts began to experiment with these methods, although no particular standard emerged as definitive or as a consensus position. There was a case that went up to the Supreme Court before Rucho called Gill versus Whitford, but the court rejected that case on standing grounds. But then Justice Kennedy retires. And because of his retirement and the change in the composition of the court, in 2019, the court basically sides with the plurality in Veith or the dissenters in Davis versus Bandemer to hold that partisan gerrymandering presents a non-justiciable political question. Rucho versus Common Cause involved a Democratic gerrymander of Maryland and a Republican gerrymander of North Carolina. The majority opinion is the same logic as Veith or of the plurality opinion in Veith, that partisanship is always going to be part of the process, but that there's no administrable standard to determine partisan fairness. So that proportionality is not sort of implicit in a single member districting system, and it was rejected by the framers of the Constitution. So the fact that, if Democrats win 40% of the seats, but gets 40% of the votes, but get 60% of the seats, that is not itself a problem under our system, because the single member district system will often create bonuses for different parties based on the number of votes that they won. Second, there are many different measures of what is fair, Chief Justice Roberts says in his majority opinion. Certainly, the kind of proportional system under Gaffney versus Cummings would be seen as fair to some, but that would lead to non-competitive districts. And so that might be seen as biased toward others. And the same concerns that were raised in Gaffney, he raises here. Some would say that no, what you need to do is adhere to traditional districting principles. And so departures from that with a partisan gerrymander is unfair. And so there's no way for the court to decide between these different measures of partisan fairness, he says. There's no legal standards discernible in the Constitution for making such judgments, let alone limited and precise standards that are clear, manageable, and politically neutral. And so Chief Justice Roberts sounds in the same language of Justice Felix Frankfurter in those earlier cases dealing with one person, one vote, where he warned about the dissent in the political thicket and the absence of any administrable standard for malapportionment. But so Chief Justice Roberts goes further and says that, look, in the language of someone like Justice Frankfurter, that what the appellees in the dissent seek is an unprecedented expansion of judicial power. We've never struck down a partisan gerrymander as unconstitutional. The expansion of the judicial authority would not be into just any area of controversy, but it's one of the most intensely partisan aspects of American political life. That intervention would be unlimited in scope and duration. It would recur over and over again around the country with each new round of redistricting. And so these fears of judicial dissent in the political thicket are, for Chief Justice Roberts, quite real when it comes to partisan gerrymandering, even if they didn't prove to prevent the one person, one vote rule from being developed. So Justice Kagan pens a quite animated dissent, which refers to what had been happening in the district courts and the state courts up until Rucho. And it also sort of describes a little bit what has happened since then. And she starts by mentioning that these really are not difficult cases in the sense that the ones that out of Maryland and North Carolina, there's really little question that these were districting plans that were drawn to maximize the electoral fortunes of the line drawing party. And so in North Carolina, for example, the Republicans who control the redistricting process crafted a gerrymander where there were 10 districts for the Republicans, 3 for the Democrats. When asked why he drew 10 Republican districts, the person who was in charge of the line drawing process in the state Senate, Senator Doug Lewis, said, well, I drew 10 because I couldn't draw 11. And so the question, the intent of trying to maximize the partisan fortunes of the Republican Party there, like the Democrats in Maryland, was really not at contested. We knew that that's what was going on in this process. And then she says, in response to Chief Justice Roberts, who said that there's no administrative standard available, she says, well, look, the lower courts in these cases came up with a standard. They used various data techniques and models in order to establish what would be seen as too much partisanship. And that it's sort of unfair, she says, to say that these cases present the question as to how we define partisan fairness. What we need to do is simply define sort of what is very unfair, right? That you can still police the outliers of a redistricting process without coming up with a particular rule that says this is the exact number of Democrats or Republicans who would be justifiably elected from these districts. And so what happened before Rucho and then by state courts afterwards is a explosion in the use of different methods in order to determine whether there's partisan bias and whether a given redistricting plan is unfair. And so these methods are an attempt to sort of pick up the baton that the Supreme Court has given off to the state courts. And so you see in these court cases a variety of measures and statistical techniques to evaluate partisan bias. So one type of method that comes up in Rucho versus Common Cause that's mentioned by both the majority and the dissent are what we call the ensemble method in redistricting, in which you have a computer generate thousands or even millions or even billions of potential maps to ascertain a distribution of when the maps are drawn without partisan factors. And so in drawing these maps, you get essentially a universe or a sample of redistricting plans. And then you say, well, and how many of them do, say, the Democrats get 2 seats and the Republicans get 8? How many of them does the reverse happen? And then if you look at the distribution of these plans, you might get a sense, well, in general, what is the most likely outcome in this redistricting process, given the rules that the state provides. And from that distribution, you can then say, all right, well, the plan that was enacted by the state is so much of an outlier that we should deem it unconstitutional. So you can see in this diagram, which was presented by the plaintiffs in Rucho versus Common Cause for North Carolina, that the enacted redistricting plan, which had 10 safe Republican districts, was a real outlier when it came to the 3,000 computer-generated plans that were placed into evidence. And so, in most of those plans, it's not as if the Democrats would have a majority, but in general, they might get 7 districts. That was the modal outcome. But in none of those did the Republicans get 10 seats. Similar kind of process would prove similar results in Maryland with respect to the Democratic gerrymander. And so these ensemble methods have become quite popular in the state courts that have been evaluating partisan gerrymandering in the wake of Rucho. But married to this kind of automated redistricting process are also measures of partisan bias to try to answer Chief Justice Roberts' question, which is how much partisanship is too much partisanship. And so I'll just mention some of the metrics here, but you can look at the website for that plan score, which is a kind of a website that scores redistricting plans according to partisan bias and other factors. That you can see the definitions there. So the definition of partisan bias is the difference between each party's share of seats and 50% in a hypothetical perfectly tied election. So for example, if a party would win 55% of a plan's districts, if it received 50% of the statewide vote, then the plan would have a bias of 5% in a party's favor. Now, as we said from the beginning, single-member districts will often produce biased outcomes. That's just the nature of the beast when it comes to geographic representation. But one thing you can hope for is that there be sort of symmetry in outcomes between Democrats and Republicans, so that if Democrats are able to move from 50% to 55%, that they should end up getting the same number of seats than Republicans would if they move from 50 to 55%. And so that's what the sort of measures of partisan bias and symmetry try to grapple with is there a second metric that's become popular is known as the efficiency gap. This tries to grapple with the problem of packing and cracking in redistricting and how to deal with sort of the inefficiency in the dispersion of votes. So that if you, for example, to create a democratic redistricting plan, maybe you would pack Republicans into as few districts as possible and spread Democratic supporters among as many districts as possible. That would be a very inefficient distribution of votes. And the efficiency gap is a measure that tries to grapple with that kind of packing and crapping. So the notion of wasted votes, the idea that you've created all these safe Republican districts where their votes would be wasted, is the critical statistical feature in measuring that. A third measure is called the mean median difference. The mean median difference is a party's median vote share minus its mean vote share across all the plan's districts. For example, if a party has a median vote share of 45% and a mean vote share of 50%, then the plan has a mean median difference of 5% against this party. When the mean and the median diverge significantly, the district distribution is skewed in favor of one party and against its opponent. Conversely, when the mean and the median are close, the district distribution is more symmetric. So this definition comes from the PlanScore website that I mentioned before. And like the efficiency gap, it's another way of measuring the dispersion of partisan adherence between different districts. Does the state end up packing Democrats in certain districts and efficiently cracking Republicans across many? In most situations, all of these statistics that I've mentioned will align in the same direction. If it's actually a partisan gerrymander, then you'll see that from all of these statistics, as well as the ensemble methods that I was discussing earlier. So here's where things stand when it comes to partisan gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymanders are non-justiciable in federal court per Rucho versus Common Cause. However, it's not as if partisan gerrymanders aren't litigated. They just continue to be attacked on other kinds of grounds like race discrimination, one person, one vote, or other state constitutional provisions. And state courts have picked up the baton that the Supreme Court has given them, and they filled the void by explicitly striking down partisan gerrymanders under certain state constitutional provisions. In 2022-23, the Supreme Court has a case actually called Moore versus Harper, where they're going to decide whether a state court striking down a state redistricting plan for congressional elections is unconstitutional under something called the independent state legislature doctrine. But for now, state courts are at least free to use all the ammunition in their state constitution to strike down redistricting plans for Congress or for state legislature. And with the Supreme Court taking federal courts out of the process, many states have turned to the initiative process in order to pass commissions to draw less partisan plans, though just because you call something a commission doesn't make it so, and certainly doesn't make it nonpartisan. Some commissions are just representatives of the state legislature from the different parties. But many states in the 2022 round, such as California, Arizona, Colorado, Michigan, have used commissions to draw district lines, but not all of them have been successful. Sometimes commissions deadlock and are unable to draw plans. That was true in New York. That was true in Virginia. True in Ohio. In Ohio, actually, they drew a plan, but then the state Supreme Court struck it down. And so redistricting and partisan gerrymandering continues to be an area with much sort of growth and flux, and the state courts are the area where we're seeing most of the litigation.